Hello everyone. Whew, it certainly has been a long day today. Well, schools have now closed and I don't know. Oh, Ratty says hello. Actually, I've asked Ratty to hide for a little bit. No, it's nothing serious, go back down. Mainly because it's his bedtime. Yes, bedtime. And so a lot of the time because this story is relevant to a dead rat. Get back down there. This is why I wanted him to hide, because I knew he wouldn't be too happy about it. I told him once about the story of the plague and he scuttered off and I didn't see him for a week or two. Yes, I eventually found you under the fridge. Go back down. Should have looked under the fridge in the first place. Should have known he was there. However, this story I have to tell because it's an interesting story about the true definition of what an idiot is. Now, when an idiot is what we would call someone who is a bit dim and can't really think for themselves. However, I would state that sometimes being an idiot is the best way of being clever. And this story is one of the stories that kind of highlights this in a way. It does involve a rat, but are you going to go to sleep or am I going to have to put my hand over your ears? Good boy. But it's dead. Down. Anyway, let's begin the story and I'll explain as we go along. Once there were 3 brothers. There was Edward, who was the eldest, Simon, who was the second eldest, and then there was John. Dimwitted John, as he was known in the village, didn't really talk much. And when he did, a lot of people said that he said a whole load of nonsense. Dimwit was a kind of way of them saying that he couldn't think very straight. Edward, the eldest, was extremely clever. He could recite anything in the newspaper in the whole wide world, as far back as any newspaper had been published. He was particularly proud of this skill and would often boast about it very often. Simon, the second eldest, was very good at quoting books. Any book in the whole wide world he'd be able to quote. It was said that he could even quote books that hadn't been published yet, although this has been proven false more than once. It was more his boast than anything else. Dimwitted John, on the other hand, kept to himself. He often played around on the farm where the 3 brothers lived, and would tend to the animals while the other 2 did their clever work, as he nicknamed it. He didn't particularly mind. His idea of life was simple. Work, sleep. Work, sleep. Sometimes play, although he used to play with the goats and the chickens. This is why he was nicknamed Dimwitted, because he never socialised with anyone. Around about the same time, the princess had reached the age of 16. She declared that she would marry the person who was the most intelligent, or rather the person who would be entertaining to her. All the other suitors in the land she'd found completely boring. She extended that invitation to anyone who would entertain her in any way, shape or form. The news of the princess's proposal arrived at the 3 brothers' farm less than a week after it had been announced. Naturally, the 3 brothers were very excited. Well, 2 brothers were very excited. Dimwitted John just chat with the chickens for the rest of the week. Edward declared that he would be able to recite the latest newspapers and the princess would accept his hand in marriage. He spent the whole entire week learning and relearning every single headline and every single paragraph in the newspapers. Simon took on the challenge as well. He declared that he would be able to recite every poem in the land, even ones that were from other countries or other kingdoms. The 2 brothers worked hard, while Dimwitted John took care of the goats and the chickens. All the other villagers looked on at Dimwitted John and wondered why he was even bothering to accept the competition. All he ever did was talk to the goat, after all. As the week ended, Edward and Simon gathered up their things, mounted their horses, and set off. Dimwitted John was about to go with them, but Simon turned round and said, "You wouldn't want to go with us, John. The princess would never be interested in you." Dimwitted John said, "Of course she will, and I'll show you." The two brothers plainly ignored their brother and headed off towards the palace. The other villagers tried to encourage John to not accept the competition, but to stay behind with his social gathering of the goat and the chicken. But John was determined. "I know," he said. "As no one will allow me to ride, I will take the goat." The villagers laughed him off as he galloped off on the goat on his way to the kingdom. By the time he'd caught up to the two brothers, they'd arrived at the edge of the forest. They were thinking of a way to cross. Dimwitted John greeted them. The two brothers snorted to themselves, shook their heads, and headed into the forest. They'd arrived at the very far end of the forest when they realised John wasn't following them. They thought this very unusual, but not unlikely. Like I said, Dimwitted John had a habit of not thinking very much. They waited and paused a bit because although they didn't appreciate John, he was their brother. By the time John had joined up with them, the two brothers were packing up after their evening snack. "Where have you been?" asked Simon. Dimwitted John held up an old copper shoe with a handle attached to it. "I found this old copper shoe with a handle on one of the trees. It must have been left by a fellow traveller. I thought the princess might appreciate it as a gift." "No princess would appreciate that kind of gift," snorted Simon. "Don't be silly, John." And they headed off once again, John trot-trotting on his goat as they went along. Eventually they arrived at a river. The two brothers crossed the bridge and was about to head on their way when they realised John was no longer following them. They waited for a bit and eventually spotted John's silhouette trot-trotting across the bridge. Why did you decide to hold us up?" said Edward. He was the less polite of the two brothers. John held up a piece of clay that he'd happened to find on the riverbank. "I thought the princess might appreciate this piece of clay," he said quite innocently. "Don't be silly and stop holding us up," said Edward. "Let's go." And the three brothers headed off again, John trot-trotting on his goat as they went. They were almost at the palace, but first they had to cross a very small moat. The two brothers crossed it easily on their horses, and at first, when they looked behind them and spotted that John was no longer following them, they thought he must have taken a different route. Him being on a goat, the moat would have been quite deep for them. However, soon after, they spotted John crossing the moat just as they did. Edward huffed and moved on his way, leaving Simon to ask the question, "John, why did you hold us up?" John held up a dead rat. "Ratty, down!" John held up a dead rat which he found on the edge of the moat. It must have been attacked by a cat for a couple of weeks ago. "I saw this dead rat," explained John, "and thought the princess might like it as a gift. She may want to eat it." Simon was starting to get a bit annoyed with John as well. "Don't be silly, John," said Simon. "The princess wouldn't want a rat to eat. She's very humble and probably has chefs to cook for her. Now come along, we are nearly there." John pocketed the rat as he'd pocketed all the other items, and they headed off towards the palace. By the time they'd got to the palace, a huge line had gathered in front of the door. John, Edward and Simon joined the line. The line was full of suitors from far and wide, some poor, some rich, but all of them were chatting about the princess. Apparently, the princess had been rather picky during the week that they'd spent rehearsing and getting to the palace. It was said that the princess had turned down nearly over 100 suitors, many of which would go into the palace and then come out grumbling about the princess's lack of choice. Slowly but surely the three brothers approached the gate, as more and more suitors were turned down by the stubborn princess. Eventually, Edward was allowed in. He approached the princess, bowed like a gentleman would. "Your Majesty, I am here to claim your hand in marriage." The princess unveiled her face. "Please," she said, "proceed." Edward looked up and stopped. The sheer beauty of the princess's face, her radiant nose, her blood-red lips, and her skin as pale as snow, had silenced his voice and stilled his mind. He couldn't even remember what had happened in the football match recently. He couldn't even remember who was the Prime Minister. After 10 minutes, the princess waved her hand. "Just like all the other suitors," she said. "Useless. Take him away." And poor Edward was taken out of the gate quite indignantly. Simon came in shortly afterwards, a little bit uncomfortable with his brother's dismissal. Like his brother, he approached the princess, who had revealed her face, and bowed low. "Your Highness," he said, "I have come to claim your hand in marriage." The princess unveiled her face as she'd done hundreds of times. "Very well, young man," she said. "You may proceed." Simon looked up and, like his brother before him, froze. He couldn't remember a single poem. He couldn't remember a sonnet. He couldn't even remember who William Shakespeare was. His tongue just refused to work and his brain refused to function. After 10 minutes, the princess revealed her face, turned to the soldiers, and demanded that Simon be led out. Poor Simon couldn't even apologize as he was led away. The guards came in later, a bit sceptical. They were followed by Dimwitted John. "Your Majesty, this man," began the soldier, but the princess waved him away. "Let him speak," she said. John bowed low. He knew manners. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have come to be your companion." This startled the princess, as she'd never been introduced like this before. But she paused to steady herself, unveiled her face, and, like the many before him, told him to proceed. John looked up, smiled, and then turned to the guard next to her. "Please, sir," he said, "I have brought a rat for me and the princess to eat. May I please have permission to cook my rat in the nearby fire?" The princess was a little bit startled. "A rat, you say?" she said. She wasn't particularly interested in this rat, but she was interested in John. "But, sir, I'm afraid our chef is off duty at the moment. We do not have a pot for you to cook your rat for us to eat in." "That's okay," said John, removing the shoe with the handle on it. "I will cook the rat in this shoe. The copper will make it taste extra special." Now the princess was even more interested. Not in the rat or the copper shoe, but in the strange man in front of her. "But I'm afraid that our vegetables have recently died down due to a famine. We may not have anything for you to make a soup or anything for you to make a sauce." "That's okay," said John. He didn't mean to interrupt. He wasn't really listening to the princess as such. He was more interested in stuffing his rat inside the clay, inside the shoe. He produced the clay as he spoke. "I will make a sauce out of this clay. It'll make the rat taste extra special." And he proceeded to walk to the fire, put the clay in the shoe with the rat, and proceeded to cook it. Now, before all of you start looking a bit cautious, I can tell you that the princess did not eat the rat, and neither did John. In fact, the rat was given to the palace cat later on that day by the princess and by her new suitor, Dimwitted John, who is no longer known as Dimwitted. You see, the princess wasn't interested in a man that wanted her riches, or her gold, or her diamonds, or even herself. She had been alone for many, many years and just wanted someone to talk to. But no one would talk to her due to her beauty. Only Dimwitted John, in his dim-witted kind of way, in his clever way, had passed the test and earned her hand in marriage. Looks like Dimwitted John was no longer dim-witted, or maybe he wasn't from the start. We all have our own ways of admitting to who we are and all of that. That's not everything that happens, though. We can play. What are you doing up? Oh, do you want to say goodbye? All right. Well, from Ratty and me, we're going to say our goodbyes. Wish you all a pleasant good night. And between you and me, I hope this chaos ends soon. I've run out of cheese. Come back, down. I'll see you tomorrow. You might not see Ratty. I'll see if I can coax him out from under the fridge. If he's under the fridge. I'll see you next time. Ta-ra.